My name is Maja Wichrowska. I'm mostly a front-end engineer at Airbnb, and I'm here to talk to you about right-to-left language support and all the infrastructure that we've built at Airbnb to get that going. So to start, a little bit of context. If you study Arabic in the United States, you're probably familiar with this book. It's called Al-Kitab. Everyone reads the same book. It's got like weird sort of like fan sites, blog posts about it. Like people have a lot of feelings about this book. And in the beginning, we're introduced to Maja, who's lives in New York City. She studies English at NYU. She's been described as a terminally pessimistic and culturally dispossessed teenager. The book is really strange. You spend like 6 chapters learning about how Maja's really lonely and like hates everybody in New York. You also meet Khalid, who lives in Cairo. He's getting an MBA from Cairo University, and he's a chronic misfit with a creepy sidekick friend. It's really a strange textbook. You learn a lot of weird things to say in Arabic. And the reason I want to introduce you to these 2 characters is because obviously this is a love story. Khalid and Maja, they have some family friends, they correspond, they like fall in love, but it's a long distance relationship. And so you can imagine if it's 2018, you want to take it to the next step, maybe Khalid wants to visit Maja over in New York City. Now, they're not quite at the point of their relationship where he can ask to stay with her. So he's a poor graduate student, which means he can't book a hotel in New York City either. It's like $300 a night. Fortunately, we have a solution. Now, obviously, Khalid's going to look for an Airbnb. And what do you think happens when he goes to Google in Arabic in Egypt, types in Airbnb, hits on feeling lucky? He gets the English language website. Now, Maja, she lives in the States, so she's obviously bilingual. But Khalid, not so much. He's lived his entire life in Egypt, and all he speaks is Arabic. Even if he studied a little bit of English, he's not about to put his money into a website that he doesn't really understand. So, it's a tragic love story. They lose contact, they stop corresponding, they drift apart, and true love is never realized. Now, I don't know about you, but I believe in true love, and I want to make this relationship work. So today, we're going to go on a journey about how we can make Airbnb work for Arabic, Persian, Hebrew, all of these other languages, and bring these 2 lovebirds together across the Atlantic. So throughout this talk, we're going to answer a number of questions. The first, why support right-to-left languages at all? Obviously, Maja and Khalid is one beautiful anecdote, but there's a lot more people out there like them. We're also going to cover why it's so difficult to do this, and what tools are already out there for us that we can leverage. And finally, we're going to talk about how we ended up solving this problem at Airbnb. So the short of it is I'm going to show you how to turn this beautiful screenshot into this. And my coworkers would like you to know this is the only appropriate use of the flip animation in Keynote. So, jumping right in, before we build all of this new infrastructure, it's important to consider who we're building it for and why it's important at all. I'm of course tempted to go back to my title slide, tell you it's the right thing to do, and just walk off the stage. But we'll go a little bit more into the details. Now, it's difficult to pinpoint an exact number of languages that are written right to left, just because some use different alphabets, some use multiple alphabets, but a huge number of people read, speak, and write these languages. Arabic alone is the 5th most spoken language in the world, with estimates from about 300 million and up to 425 million people worldwide speaking some variant of it. And if you couple that with Hebrew, Persian, Urdu, all these other languages, you easily add another 250 million people or so who would benefit from a web that readily supports right-to-left languages. Now, since Arabic is the most popular of these languages, we also have the most data on Arabic internet users and the growing Arab digital generation in the Middle East. Internet penetration in the Middle East is actually higher than the global average of 51.4%, clocking in at near 60% of people on the internet. And in some countries, like Qatar and the UAE, actually over 90% of the population has regular access to the internet. And these aren't just casual users. 40% of what's been dubbed the Arab digital generation, they're not just online in internet cafes. They're online 5 hours or more a day. And even if your particular business doesn't exist in the Middle East, Arabic speakers have spread out all over the world. They're here in Italy, they're in the US, they're in Brazil. And in fact, 4 to 5% of all internet users speak Arabic. That's a huge number. And while English speakers have grown about 600% since 2000, Arabic speakers have grown over 7,000%, which is enormous. And when you look at the statistics that people have done, consulting groups have put together a lot of papers, over 60% of Arabic speakers would prefer content in their own language, which seems like it should be obvious, but it's worth mentioning. It's so much so that they actually prefer blogging and other sort of content creation platforms so they can fill that gap and create Arabic language content. So, how are we doing as developers? Turns out only about 1 to 3% of the world's top 10 million websites have any Arabic content at all. Now, I know that the people in this room are the ones who can really move the statistic in a positive direction. But the challenge is, for a lot of our applications, this has become non-trivial. How many in this room have ever built a website that supported a right-to-left language? Okay, a few, great. So you may know a little bit about why this is so difficult. And we're gonna dive a little bit more into the details. If we were just supporting basic Arabic content, like this greeting I might send a host introducing myself, saying my name is Maja, this is super simple. We just write a line our text, and we're done with it. That's the entire process. But, of course, Airbnb, like a lot of other platforms, has a ton of user-generated content. So this creates a bi-directional environment, where we have some language going right to left and some going left to right. And even if we could fully control all of the content on our page, surprise, Hebrew and Arabic are actually bidirectional by default. Numbers are still read left to right. So you're gonna have to deal with that bidirectionality no matter what. Now, bidirectional inputs are even trickier. If you have to be able to handle content in whatever language the user chooses, that opens up a ton of questions about what is the best user experience. Do you justify the input based on the content of the page? Do you decide on the fly based on what the user inputs? What about prefixes and suffixes? How do we deal with numerical inputs, mixed inputs, text? All of this stuff leads to a ton of open questions about how to create the best user interface. Then, of course, we add stylings, asymmetric padding, corners, border radiuses, and all of this is going to have to be mirrored as well to make sense in a right-to-left context. And finally, iconography and other images also have to be taken into account. If text is flowing right to left, it makes sense that chevrons, arrows, and other similar images may have to flip as well. But what about IDs, or search icons, or check marks, or even universal symbols like for accessibility? There's a ton of icons out there, and we were left with honestly more questions than when we started about what needs to be flipped and what doesn't. And the end result is that you're gonna need to have some leeway to choose which images to flip and which to remain in kind of that left to right direction. So in summary, to have a truly comprehensive system for right to left language support, we not only need to handle bidirectional content in the same page, but sometimes in the same sentence. We need to figure out how to allow for users to input content in whatever language that they choose. we need to allow for styles to be mirrored in ways that make sense, and we have to have the same allowance for images as well. And maybe most importantly, we want a way to selectively opt out of any of these options in the case where it makes sense to keep things in that left to right context. So the big question becomes, at Airbnb we have 1,000 engineers, maybe 500 of which are working on the product at any given time, building new features, rewriting old features, building new UIs. How do we implement all of this without dramatically disrupting their workflows or having to rewrite all 10,000 of our React components in one go? So the first thing we can do here is analyze what tools are already available to us out there. And the main one at our disposal is this HTML dir attribute. This is not a new feature. This is kind of the opposite of a new feature. This was introduced to the HTML spec in 1999 and was meant as a holistic solution to questions of directionality in our UI. This means that the browser support is exceptional, but that it was also built for a very different web. So if we were to time travel back to the 90s and take a look at this beautiful brutalist Airbnb.com, if we were to set the dir attribute to LTR on the top level, we'd actually have enormous success off the bat. This attribute was designed to flip all tabular and inline block content. So you can see that everything's right-aligned as expected. Information like our calendar or even our grid of experiences has been mirrored.
Replicating, eating up memory. What do I do?
Labels
Type
are on
cookie,
the correct
you
side
idiot.
of the inputs.
I'll head him
Everything
off
looks
at the
pretty
pass.
good. So, it seems like the
We have a zero
basics
bug
that
attacking
for us
all login and
get
overlay files.
Run
our
antivirus. Give me a
first
systems
step towards
display.
the MVPs. Set this dir attribute
Down one
to the top
section,
of the
26. Nope, make that 10 to 40.
We decided that as the same
Die,
time we set
dickweeds.
it might make sense to have components down the tree have access to that variable.
Rabbit is in the administration system.
Send a flu shot.
Rabbit, flu shot, someone talk to me.
Rabbit replicates till it overloads a file, then it spreads.
One of my coworkers, Yaniv Zimet, conceived of and implemented this particular library called React with Direction, which is open source. You can definitely check it out. It follows a basic structure that we've been using for a lot of other top-level variables in our application, things like breakpoints or loading state or even internal brands. The basic way it works is it ships with this direction provider component. And this is what sets that variable on some top-level DOM node. And it sets the HTML attribute as well. We also ship a with direction wrapper for any components down the tree that want to access the value and change their behavior accordingly. So in action, if we have our very basic React Hello World application, we'd probably start by just setting this direction provider wrapping the entire application and setting that direction to some constant, or more likely based on some top-level language setting. And this alone is very simple. All it gives us is this dir attribute on a top-level node. And also, it'll do that basic flipping of inline block and tabular information we saw before. Now, this by itself doesn't give us too much, but if we combine it with the wrapper, like let's say we wanted to build a directional step incrementer component, we may start with our stepper, we'd have an icon that when you clicked it, it would increment that number. So if we wrap this in a direction provider, looks great. Only problem is our icon's kind of pointing in the wrong direction. So what we'd want to do in this case is create a context-aware icon that would choose an image appropriately. We could call it icon chevron next. In the default case, it still would point in that right direction, but if we wrap it in our with direction wrapper, we can now change the behavior when we're in a right to left context. In that context, we can return a chevron that points left. If we drop this in, instead of just our regular icon, we can see it works exactly as expected. And this becomes even more powerful for more complicated UIs, like React Dates, our open source date picker here. We can use that with direction wrapper to flip the animation, change the icons, and do some really more complex interactions. So our first point, now that we have these two basic tools, is to look at maybe one of our more content-heavy pages, something like the Airbnb listing page, and see how many things we would have to wrap in with direction and adjust based on this value. And so we set the direction provider at the top, and unfortunately, it seems like there's quite a lot of work to be done. Even the most basic thing, like the fact that this book it box is floated to the second half of the page, doesn't get mirrored. In fact, you can see that the padding is kind of screwed up, and not a lot of things have been changed, and it's because we rely a ton on CSS styles to build all of our layouts, something that's happened to all of us, I think, in this Web 2.0 world. So none of this gets flipped automatically. All of this would need a manual touch. Now, at this point, we were working with about 2.5 engineers, which wasn't enough to go through and change every component's styles based on whether we were in a right-to-left context or a left-to-right context. So we started investigating automated options. And there's a lot of libraries out there. There's things like R2 and CSS Flip, RTL CSS, CSS Janus. There's even a Webpack plugin that you can like hook up into all of your things and just flip all of that styling automatically. But these all came with one major caveat, which is that they were built for CSS style sheets. And while this may have been useful back in 2014 when Airbnb was primarily a Backbone.js, Sass, Ruby on Rails shop, we would have different style sheets for each of our routes, and like all of our JavaScript controller code lives separately. We started moving over to React that year. And we used this opportunity to kind of revisit how we were doing styling. And specifically, we asked ourselves, how do we style our React components while minimizing side effects, performance impact, and implicit dependencies that had come to be inexplicably intertwined with all of our CSS? And the answer for us, and I say for us because it may not be for you, was to put our CSS inside our JavaScript. And this meant that any solution for automatic style flipping was not going to be a CSS-only solution. It was not going to be a transform of our style sheets. It was going to have to deal with our JavaScript dependencies directly. So, surprise, this is actually a talk about CSS and JavaScript. I bet that wasn't expected. Our solution of choice was Khan Academy's lovely open source package called Aphrodite. And basically all of our components would just sit on top of this package and rely on it to do all of the style implementation. There are 2 points that we'll talk about that we can kind of hook into to maybe address this automatic style flipping question. The first was at compile time, and basically, this is the component would have a preset JavaScript object that would have this class name style paradigm. It would pass it to Aphrodite, and Aphrodite would do some magic under the hood that doesn't really matter, and pass back an object with references to those styles that we could access later. And so this we'll refer to as the create step. This is the first of 2 opportunities we have to access all of the styles for our components. The second opportunity happens at runtime, and this is basically when the component uses that styles reference that it got back from Aphrodite in the beginning, and it wants to apply them to a DOM node. So it says, I want this container style, I also want the large container style. Aphrodite, please give me something I can work with. And Aphrodite returns a class name in this case that you can just apply to your DOM node. And this is what we'll refer to as the resolve method. And so these 2 steps combined give us not 1, but 2 entry points where we could access our style definitions and maybe do some work to flip them for right to left. But any changes in this system would either have to be in our components, which is exactly what we're trying to avoid. We're not trying to rewrite every component in our system. Or in Aphrodite, which at this point is a pretty well-starred, well-used package, and maybe not the right staging ground for what is essentially an experimental technology at this point. Fortunately, or unfortunately, we actually already had an abstraction layer that we had built in. Because CSS in JavaScript is like, we're not quite ready for it, no one's decided what's like the one true path forward, we wanted to future-proof our components so that we wouldn't have to rewrite them. In this case, we created this layer called React with Styles, which would dictate how our components were written, no matter what the style implementation was. And it would interact with interfaces that would translate various implementations into a form that React with Styles could understand. So in this case, this allowed us to easily swap between Aphrodite to JSS, or even build our components for React Native, or somewhat hilariously, we have an interface that turns this all back into CSS style sheets. And it provided a great opportunity for us to work in these middle layers without having to touch either our styling implementation or our components themselves. So to talk a little bit about how this works first, is it's very similar to what we looked at before. At create, the component passes down the styles object with these kind of class name definitions. React with Styles doesn't really understand that concept, so it defers to its interface. And the interface talks to Aphrodite to see what Aphrodite does in this situation. So in that case, things get passed back up the tree, the component gets its reference. The main difference here is that it gets it as a prop, because React with Styles actually provides a wrapper around the component. So we don't have to save it, we don't have to deal with that, it's just available to us. And then at resolve, again, things are very similar. We have these styles references, we're getting it from props now, we want to resolve it onto a particular DOM node. We talk to React with Styles. Again, React with Styles, it's a very dumb layer, it doesn't know how to do anything, so it just defers to its interface, which again talks to Aphrodite, and then we can see it goes back up the tree, and you get a class name that you can spread onto your DOM element. One of the things about React with Styles is we're not tied to a particular implementation, so you don't actually know whether you're getting back an inline style or a specific class name. You just get an object, and then you just apply whatever's in it onto the DOM node. The one thing we added because of this abstraction layer is the ability to have dynamic styles on the fly. So you can imagine if you have a background image that's returned from the API, or if you're doing some calculation in JavaScript to animate the position of an element, you want to pass that in as an object at runtime instead of defining it as at compile time. This gets passed to to the React with Styles interface, which again doesn't really know what to do with it, defers to its interface. The interface, because it's specifically been built as the translator for Aphrodite, it knows that Aphrodite only deals with class names. Aphrodite doesn't know what to do with this. So it decides to pass it back as an inline style. So this ends up just getting spread onto the DOM node. Again, we don't know, the component doesn't really understand whether it's getting inline styles or class names. It just spreads it on, deals with that, styles get applied, and we're done. Now, this is important because this creates a new challenge, these dynamically generated styles at runtime that also are going to need to be flipped for a right-to-left context. So it's something important to consider. What's great about this system is that actually this interface layer, this is exactly where we want to do all of our work. Any changes to React with Styles, because it defines how the components build their styles, would affect our components. And any changes to Aphrodite would affect everyone else in the world, which we don't want to do. But at this interface, the sweet spot is where we can do all of our experimentation for right to left. So, coming back to the problem at hand, we defined some requirements for our implementation. In particular, we wanted to handle all directional styles, so things like margins, borders, border radius, positioning, even transforms that we're translating from a certain side, all directional styles need to be handled. And we wanted, this is probably the most important one, no changes to our existing components. We want this solution to be invisible to the developer. It should just work. We should just be able to show a Hebrew-Arabic page and be good with it. We want to handle both the compile time created class names for Aphrodite as well as dynamically generated objects at runtime. And we want it to have pretty minimal performance impact, so we don't want to be doing a ton of work at any given time. So our first attempt, this is always good, because if there's an attempt 1, there's going to always be an attempt 2. But I think it's important to walk through the history. We had some important considerations going into the process. First, create happens at compile time, so not at the render, and we don't have access to React context. And while resolve happens at runtime, the way that things were implemented at this time was that it was exported as a global from React with styles, which meant that it also didn't have access to that directional context we defined in the directional provider. What this means is that we don't have a situation, a path that runs in right to left and a separate path in left to right. We have to handle both situations at the same time with the same code. But we had a few things that we could leverage as well. That direction provider existed on every single one of our applications on every page. We always had that dir attribute set on a top-level DOM node. And Aphrodite, interestingly enough, has a built-in plugin system that's designed to handle fancier CSS selectors, to get it more attuned to that actual CSS style sheet world. So our first attempt was to leverage that plugin system and create descendant selectors for default styles in a dir equals LTR context, and then flipped styles in that dir equals RTL context. What does this actually mean? Well, looking at what Aphrodite does, if we define this beautiful class name to change some text color to red, this gets turned into the same class name as at the beginning. The object gets hashed deterministically and somewhat performantly, and that's the CSS that we generate. Now, what I mean by fancy selectors is if we preface anything with a colon, Aphrodite has built in a system that processes this and turns this into the appropriate pseudo-selector. So you can do active state, focus, hover, all this sort of stuff in Aphrodite, even though it's JavaScript. Similarly, you can add an @media query, and that also gets converted through the same plugin system into an actual match media CSS query on the page. So for us, we wanted to create special fancy selectors for Aphrodite to deal with. In this case, we'd have this underscore RTL and this underscore LTR, which would be the mirrored version of each other. And this would get transformed into these descendant selectors. So if we were in that RTL page, we'd have the flipped version. But if we were in our default case, we'd get the CSS as intended and as written. Now, this alone is obviously not enough to satisfy our requirements, because this would mean rewriting every single one of our components to have both sets of styles. And again, Airbnb, 500 engineers, 10,000 components, 2.5 people working on this project. Really not the ideal scenario for rewriting every component in our system. But we have that React with styles situation we can leverage. So we came back to our building blocks. Looking at the create, it was an okay place to work, but the reality was it didn't give us access to those dynamic runtime generated styles. So we kind of just ignored it for this first step, and of focusing entirely on the resolve. The main difference we built in here is we'd have that styles reference, we'd have that dynamic style, that would get passed to React with styles, which again would defer to its interface. And then the interface before, when dealing with those static styles, those styles.foo objects, it would basically just pass it unchanged to Aphrodite and then return whatever Aphrodite brought back, in this case a class name up the tree. But now, what we would do is transform it into that special new plugin we just wrote. And we'd do this by leveraging Kent Dodd's RTL CSS-JS library, which is really lightweight, really fast, and basically does all of that automatic flipping for us. And then we'd enable our custom plugin in Aphrodite, and in theory, it should all just work. So the way that would look is we'd have this resolve static styles method, and we dug into the implementation details of Aphrodite a little bit to see what that actually looked like. It turns out you had your class name, and you also had access to the definition right there. So we could call RTL CSS-JS on the definition, put that on the RTL key, and then give back the default case on the LTR key. That gets flipped, and we pass that to Aphrodite instead of the default situation. And Aphrodite, of course, goes back up the tree and gives us a class name. But the difference now is that the injected styles on the page have those descendant selectors. So instead of the one class name and definition, we have a right-to-left context and a left-to-right context. So that takes care of the static styles. What about the dynamic styles? This is a bit trickier. We, of course, still defer to the interface. React with styles isn't doing any work here. But before, we'd simply pass those back up the tree unchanged as inline styles. We'd simply put them onto the DOM element. But now, you can't have descendant selectors with inline styles. That doesn't work. You need actual CSS. So what we did on the fly is transform them into Aphrodite style class names. We've already done that dissection. We've seen the double underscore name, double underscore definition. That's all it needs to be treated as an Aphrodite class name. And we'd, of course, enable the custom plugin in Aphrodite still. And most importantly, we'd only do this if there was a reason to. A background image that's just a URL, we can still have that as an inline style. But for anything that references like left or margin left, we'd want to do the flipping. So the way this would look is we'd use the same hash method from Aphrodite to generate this inline style class name. We do the two keys as before and flip the RTL context. And then we'd use that resolve static styles method that Aphrodite had to get a class name back. And of course, Aphrodite would do the magic under the hood to actually put the style on the page, pass back the class name, and what we'd see in our actual styles is that this would get applied. This was pretty powerful on its own. And remember, we did this without touching any of our components. They all looked exactly the same as they always did. And so you can see our listing card, just with this change, perfectly flipped. With our icon chevron next and previous, they were even pointing in the right direction, and the carousel would navigate forward when you pressed on the right side. And maybe the most impressive, we had this slick little switch row that has this cute rolling animation that's done in CSS. Without any extra work, it just magic, right to left context, rolling in the right direction. This is pretty cool. So we were done, or so we thought. The failures. Descendant selectors, while great, don't allow for switching of context. So for us, you have an Arabic listing page, you have an English review. And you need those to be styled according to their content. And what would end up happening is that English review would end up getting both the right to left and left to right styles. That's a problem. We also ran into some weird specificity issues with the descendant selectors not playing super nice with other styles that were on the page that weren't in those descendant selectors. And maybe most importantly, React 16 came out. Now, we're a server rendering, client rendering shop. And while React 16 brought us many, many, many wonderful things, it also brought us to a world of server-client mismatches. And these would manifest themselves in really strange ways. The biggest problem here was that inline style conversion that we were doing was not happening in the same way on the server as it was on the client. And the effect of which was that our pages were kind of a hodgepodge of flip styles and non-flip styles, and we were seeing really weird behavior as a result. So we had to go back to the drawing board and iterate on this first solution. Not change completely, but just maybe tweak some of our requirements. So looking back, we still had these 4, but we were willing to make one concession, which is namely that we would allow changes to our components as long as it was something that we could do with a script. So if we didn't need a manual touch, we could write a node code mod that would run through all of our components and change whatever needed to be changed. That was acceptable. And then, of course, we wanted to handle that context switching. And we wanted not to introduce any new specificity issues, so maybe descendant selectors weren't the right choice. And finally, we wanted to make sure we address the server-client mismatch from the get-go. So, the new strategy became using contextual create and resolve methods based on direction. Whereas before, we had this compile time create and this runtime resolve, what we would do instead is have a create for an LTR context and a create for an RTL context. And we do the same for the resolve. Again, we mentioned this before, but compile time, we don't have any information about the language of the page or the direction that we're in. So we ended up deferring that to first render, which is actually a little bit of a performance win in this case, because we'd only create the styles for what was actually rendered on the page, instead of what was being imported. And then for the resolve, we would try to pass it down as a prop instead of as a global, so we could leverage that directional context. So much in the same way as that styles reference gets passed down from React with styles, we would pass down the resolve method as well. So the difference here, our component defines its styles, has its container, and it's lovely like CSS definitions. React with styles now has access to the directional context. That is what we built in because we're in that first render. We're in our first mount. So it asks for specifically the right to left create method. And then in the default case, it would ask for the left to right. The right to left case is obviously more interesting because it's been changed. We'll flip those styles before passing to Aphrodite. And so we get that reverse situation. Aphrodite again, does some magic under the hood, whatever, injects some styles, creates some globals, passes it up the tree, and the component gets that styles reference back as a prop again. On the resolve side, we again have some static styles from Aphrodite before, as well as some dynamically generated styles. We have access to the static styles don't matter in this case because we've already dealt with them at the create step, so all we really care about is those dynamic objects. And React with styles can access, again, the right to left context, so it knows to call the particular resolve method for there. And in this case, again, the interface, it knows that Aphrodite primarily deals with class names, and if we don't have to be doing that conversion, we don't want to. So the interface can flip these styles and just pass them back as an inline style object as well. So takes this left, changes it to a right, and passes it up to the tree where it can be applied as an inline style again. And the only thing you need to modify in our basic React components is this resolve that was originally a global export from React with styles. We code mod it into our props object. And that ended up being really powerful. You can see in our final listing page, book it box on the correct side, all the padding is correct, the alignment is as expected. And just with these basic steps and minimal changes to our components, we were able to make this happen. And maybe most importantly, we're able to bring Maja and Khalid true love. So, thank you. I talked about some open source projects here. We have React with Direction, React with Styles. These are both under the Airbnb namespace. You can also find Kent Dodd's really excellent RTL CSS-JS library. And finally, please tweet at me. I'd love to hear your feedback or answer any questions. And I think we have some time for questions now. So yeah, great.
Any question?